podcast.
This is take two. Take two of this week's episode. You run into a very kind of strange position sometimes where you develop a persona for a podcast. You develop an idiom, you develop a delivery. And my delivery has at least attempted to be kind of upbeat, kind of light, especially lately, because I've been facing some kind of heavy stuff in my personal life. And it would be very easy to come on here and bring that heaviness with me. I don't want to do that because I don't want to spread it around. And I'm not being disingenuous when I come on here with this particular persona. But there are just times when it becomes just a bit fraudulent, just a bit too much. And I'm feeling that right now. I just did a take one of this where I opened with the line, what if we're all just sea monkeys in some giant kid's aquarium? Because I've been facing existential questions this week. And sometimes when you do that, you go down this rabbit hole of why are we here and how did we get here and what's the point of it all? The ultimate conclusion is maybe we're just sea monkeys in some giant kid's aquarium. And that makes life a lot easier to sort out. And I'm thinking all of this specifically in reference to the wildfires that are burning up Los Angeles. And let me begin all of this with just sending my best wishes to our friends who are in LA, who have been guests on this program. I think of Nikki Bond. I think of Tyler Olson. I think of our old pal, Rakefet Abergel, who assures me that she is safe down there. And as far as I know, the others are too. But if you aspire to any sort of a spiritual life, if you are giving yourself, if you are surrendering to a spiritual view of the world, inevitably you're going to run up against this question, why do bad things happen to good people? And I've just never been able to reconcile that question into some sort of a really good answer. You grow up in the Christian world, you're taught to believe in a God who is omnipresent, omnipotent, all-powerful, all-knowing, present everywhere, and has the capability, has the power to stop a World War I, to stop a Holocaust, to stop Chernobyl, to stop 9/11, to stop Katrina, to stop the LA wildfires. And for whatever reason, she chooses not to. And then when you ask the question, why? The answer is usually some variation of, well, the Lord works in mysterious ways. And perhaps she does, but that still feels like kind of a cop-out, you know? But it's not just me. Even Ram Dass himself came up against this question of suffering in the world. And he lived a lot of the time in India, where there is just poverty and suffering everywhere you look. And in the 80s, he worked a lot with AIDS patients. And then later in life, he dedicated himself kind of to hospice care and working with the dying. Somebody was dying, they'd call up Ram Dass and say, Ram Dass, please come and see this person. And it wasn't some sort of like priestly last rites kind of thing. It was just conscious dying. It was just let me, to the extent that I can, guide you peacefully into this transition. I forget who it was that told Ram Dass, you don't have to worry about dying. It's perfectly safe. Who am I to say? But he struggled with this too. He struggled with this question of why is there so much suffering in the world? And he came to this conclusion, which is very difficult for me yet to grasp, that the value of suffering is that it can provide a path to awakening. Maybe. He was a lot more spiritually adept and a lot smarter and a lot more wise than me. But I'm not going to be the person who goes down to Altadena and tells a whole neighborhood that the silver lining about their houses being gone and all of their possessions is that, well, here's a great path to awakening. The time of those figs is not yet. And I don't know how to reconcile it. All right, I don't know how to reconcile a lot of the darkness that's in the world right now. The reality is, even if you aspire to a spirituality, we live in a physical world. And the root of physical is physics. All right, there are physical laws of this planet we live on. And so the elements combined whereby a fire could start somewhere in California, and then the wind picked up and blew that fire into Los Angeles. That's just simple physics. And it would be nice if our leaders, instead of making politics out of that, displayed some sort of human decency and empathy. I'm not speaking of anyone in particular. But who am I to say how a president-elect should act under these circumstances? And I just don't know. I just don't know what to say about it all. It's really, really difficult to have, on one hand, this idea that I'm reluctant to say things happen for a reason. I think in retrospect, you can find a reason in things. I want to believe that things happen for a reason, but it's really, really tough for me to look at what's going on in Los Angeles and say things happen for a reason. And I talk a lot. I never tire of saying have faith in the way things are, but I think we have to contemplate that as well. Because those of us who come from a Christian background, and even if you're not traditionally didn't grow up in a church family, you grew up in a culture, probably if you're in the Western world, that finds its philosophical roots in Christianity. And so the word faith becomes identified again with this God who's in charge of everything, has the power to stop things and doesn't, orchestrates all the pieces, moves us around like pieces on a chessboard. And that is kind of a loose, very simple, basic Christian worldview. Evangelical, at least, Christian worldview, but I think beyond that as well. But this idea of having faith in the way things are might be interpreted somewhat more subtly than that. And I was thinking about it today, and I thought maybe what that means is not have faith necessarily that the way things are is for the best and for your highest good, although they may very well be, but maybe it just means don't deny the way things are. Don't bury your head in the sand, all right? Accept the way things are at face value. It doesn't mean you don't want to change the way things are, but it's like denying the way things are will not get you anywhere. And so when I say have faith in the way things are, what I mean maybe is accept reality. I mean, I could be burying my head in the sand right now about some of the stuff that's gone on in my life in the past 5 months, some of it very painful, some of it very disorienting, some of it incredibly difficult. And I could, instead of having faith, I could pretend it's otherwise. I could pretend all is well. I could pretend things aren't changing. And that might provide, a few minutes of solace here and there, or at least provide a way to push away the inevitable crashing reality that's coming. And so instead, we have faith in the way things are. We believe the way things are. We don't fool ourselves about it, right? We don't deny the way things are to ourselves. And so you're a resident of Los Angeles and your whole neighborhood is gone. Having faith in the way things are, at least from that Christian perspective, very, very difficult to do, I would expect. Although I'm sure there's some people who are. I'm sure there are some people out there who are adept enough and far along enough to look at that circumstance and be like, okay, something good will come of this, which is entirely possible. I'm not sure I would be that good. I think I would struggle a little bit with that. I can't even speculate really on how I would deal with that circumstance. I've seen it happen. I've seen people I know whose houses burned down, and that is a devastating thing. To see your whole neighborhood gone and then to realize the fundamental powerlessness you have against nature, incredibly difficult. And I can't imagine whose faith wouldn't be rocked by that, whose foundations, whose stability wouldn't be rocked by that. I'm certainly not going to tell them to believe that this is for the best. But maybe having faith in the way things are is merely not denying the reality and then facing up to it as best you can and then trying to move forward I think that's probably the best you can do. And so when you look at suffering in the world, the best you can do is not deny that suffering, maybe, and not look away and not pretend otherwise. And that is the faith. That is the not denying the reality that exists. Doesn't necessarily make it better, doesn't necessarily make it easier, but at least if you're coming at it from that perspective, you can recognize the suffering and then do what bit you can to alleviate the suffering. And that is another thing that Ram Dass came to. In fact, somebody, my pal Minus, posted the following on Facebook just today. It is a quote/paraphrase of what Ram Dass said. Quote, "Whether this is the first day of the apocalypse or the first day of the golden age, the work remains the same: to love each other and ease as much suffering as possible." That's not an abdication. That is Ram Dass saying, I don't know. I don't know why things happen. I don't know why there's so much suffering. My job is not to know why. My job is to alleviate that suffering to the greatest extent possible. And I think that is probably the highest virtue. And so you look at what's happening in Los Angeles, and you look at the people who want to just take this as an opportunity to point blame, score cheap political points, who demonstrate no empathy whatsoever, and you can become frustrated by that. And you can take a look at that, and you can say, why do these people who have that voice, why have they been elevated to that voice? Why are we hearing that voice at all? And how can they be that cold? How can they be that cruel? How can they be that petty and shameless? And I don't have the answer to that. And then you can find yourself very quickly falling into a judgment, and then you have to process that judgment, and then that feels sick inside the way I feel sick inside right now. And all that does is get you into that negative headspace. All it does is pull you down into that fight. Now, people always say when some crazy, heinous thing happens, they say, look for the heroes. Look for the virtue, and that is the real inspiration. You think of 9/11, those of you who are alive to watch that happen, which I did in real time on my television set, the most heinous day I've ever seen in my life. And the stories of heroism will just break your heart. You know, you can see in these things the very worst of humanity. You can see in these things the very most cynical parts of humanity, or you can see in these things the greatest virtues of humanity, of sacrifice and heroism and empathy and love. And much better to focus in on those stories of heroism, much better to focus in on the ways in which people in those awful circumstances are working to alleviate suffering. That's a great inspiration. I wish we didn't have that inspiration. I wish that was not happening right now. But what do? You have faith in the way things are. This is happening right now. I believe this is happening. This is real, and I can't deny it, and I can't look away. And so what can I do in any circumstance to alleviate that suffering in just a little way? Maybe it's simply a message to your friend in LA that says, hey, you okay down there? Can I help in some way? You know, letting people know that they're not alone. Maybe that's the best you can do with it. Maybe you can donate to something. I don't know. All right. I'm trying to reckon with this myself from a spiritual perspective, because the spiritual people are supposed to have all the answers, right? And spiritual people, again, in our Judeo-Christian tradition, are always tied to this notion of an all-powerful consciousness that has the ability to manipulate reality in our physical world. And you come to, George Carlin came to one of two conclusions. He's like, either God is incompetent or God just doesn't care. Pick one or the other. Neither is very comforting, But again, I'm not coming at this from a Christian perspective. I'm trying to come at this from a spiritual, conscious perspective that says there are dimensions, there are layers of consciousness that we can access but don't normally access, or don't know how to access, or have forgotten how to access. And there's stuff going on in those planes of existence that are a little bit beyond our understanding. And I'm already talking myself in circles because I don't have an answer. I don't have an answer to why bad stuff like this happens. I think the best we can do is the Ram Dass approach, which is okay. This is going on. We don't know why. Our job is to alleviate suffering in the world. And in a weird way, it pulls me around to a conversation I had with our old pal Sarah McDougall on the weekend, which was going to be the crux of this episode until I got to thinking about darkness. I got to thinking about fires and inaugurations. And I don't know, but it provides kind of an interesting segue because I was out with my pal Sarah having a drink, singer-songwriter extraordinaire, past guest on this program, one of the OG guests on this program, the great Sarah McDougall. If you're not listening to her, you should be. And we got to talking, as it's January, about the year ahead. You know, we are ambitious people. We are working people. And we tend to focus forward. We tend to focus in on what's coming up, what we want to do, what we'd like to accomplish, what we'd like to grow, what we're doing. And we get into that conversation in a little bit because she's really doing some really cool stuff musically and as a producer. And there's lots of great stuff on her horizon. My horizon's somewhat more cloudy. Not necessarily bad, just a little bit obscured, you know? And then she stopped and she's like, I was talking to somebody and I forget who it was, I'm sorry, who said something profound to her, which was, I'm paraphrasing, but before you look too far ahead, don't forget to just stop and take a look back at the last year and note your successes. Well, that's an interesting thought, isn't it? I mean, I don't usually note my successes. I'm far more wrapped up in my failures. So I took that home with me after that evening out, and I thought about the last year. I mean, I'd rather not think about a lot of the last year, but in fact, that informs me a little bit, and it provides a bit of the success that she's talking about. I mean, we think of success usually in tangible or financial terms. That doesn't show up real well on my chart for the past year. Do have this job that is helping. I was thinking about, well, geez, what did I do last year? Mel Robbins had a good one too. Her New Year's Day episode was compelling, where she talked about, take an hour, go through your phone, go through your photographs from the last year that are on your phone. And if you're like me, you've got like 1,000 photos of last year. And I'm not even a habitual photo taker anymore. She's like, go through those photos and just note the stuff that I'm sure you forgot about that you went to or did or took photos of or experienced. And it's a great way to jog your memory about the year past. And I did that a little bit. I looked through January, February. I was like, I totally forgot about a gig that I played or a thing that I went to or an event that happened, whatever. Really, really interesting way. And, thanks to the smartphone, we're all keeping kind of a running daily tab on our activities, even though we never look at the friggin' photos again. Interesting thing to do. And so I was looking back at the past year, and for me, it's kind of difficult, especially when it comes to music, because pre-pandemic, I was playing 100 gigs a year. I was touring. I was doing all the stuff. And it's like, I take a look back at music over the past year, and it's like, geez, feels like a bit of a failure by comparison, but it isn't actually. Because if you're a musician, you know as well as I do that the sea change has happened. Talk about the burning down. Man, so many venues closed. I was looking at a photograph that popped up in my Facebook memories of 8 years ago, playing the Fog Lounge with the Carly Band. Great little room in Windsor, Ontario, Canada. And I think the fog is gone. I think it's gone now. And that was one of the indie venues, man. You'd go, I played there with Hearts. I played there with Carly. The fog, man. And other rooms all across the friggin' country closed. So many venues gone. A casualty of the pandemic. People couldn't keep them open. There was no live music. You weren't allowed to gather. So it's understandable, right, that post-pandemic, the sea has changed a little bit. There aren't as many gigs as there were. It's beginning to change, but the venues are gone. And so I shouldn't beat myself up about not having played 100 gigs last year. The opportunities just aren't the same. Then I stepped back and I'm like, well, I don't know what I played, something like 25. And I played with Fresh Breath and Kay and Carly and the Lindsay Band. And it's just like, this is a success. The fact that I'm out there at all, still playing, that I came back to the scene, and there was a point during the pandemic where I wondered if I was going to play out anymore. I just got, like a lot of musicians got, comfortable being home on a Friday night instead of in a bar at 1 a.m. People began to realize maybe this is not worth it, to be playing out so much. There was a moment where I thought maybe I wouldn't come back, and then there was anxiety, and there was all that stuff that went with it. My mind was not in a great spot. But I did come back, and last year I played some really, really good gigs. I met some really, really cool people along the way, and that's a success, And then I thought about the podcast. I took very long hiati from the podcast last year when stuff was going down, but I still managed to produce something close to 32 episodes, 31, 32 episodes of this thing. And that is an accomplishment. There's still, I don't know if this is like an urban legend or not, but there's a stat that goes around all the time that says most podcasts don't get past episode 7. 7 apparently is the benchmark. If you beat 7, then you've done really, really well. This is like 208. So not bad. I don't know if that's success or just stubbornness. Maybe a little column A, a little column B, but I produced the episodes. And I made them, and whether they're successful or not by certain metrics, they exist. And so I put myself into that. So I played gigs, and I made the podcast, and then my great triumph of the year, kind of dark as it sounds, is simply surviving the past 4 or 5 months of it. Watching my life as I knew it disintegrate. Watching a marriage fall apart. And then struggling mightily with trying to find a job so that I could begin to rebuild some foundations for whatever is coming later. And then dealing with the suffering that came with that, the anxiety, the existentialism, the pain, and somehow managing through most of that to keep it together. Right? And to approach this with a spiritual frame of mind, to approach this with consciousness. I think my spouse and I have really been successful together in navigating this journey amicably and making it okay for each other and not turning on each other and not making this as heinous as a lot of separations go. We've managed to dissolve our marriage, but remain living together for the past several months, and, everything is okay there. Yeah, there were dark times. There will be dark times. Yeah, there was suffering, and yeah, there were moments where I cried out and yelled at the universe or source or whatever is out there that's supposed to be in charge of all this, but I still held on to this idea of having faith in the way things are and surrendering, again, that word surrender, into this separation and whatever it means for my life going forward, and holding on to this idea, holding on to this belief that the best is still yet to come, and this divine timing that I talked about on the last episode. I don't think that is Pollyanna stuff. I don't think that is burying my head in the sand stuff. I think, in fact, it's the opposite. I think it's acknowledging a reality and then adopting a mindset, because you can very easily adopt the negative mindset to something like that and become egoic and become cruel and become angry and make things a problem and feel as though it's just never going to be okay again. And there were moments where I did feel that consciously. There were moments where I sat where I'm sitting at this moment and said, I don't see a future. I don't see how this resolves itself in a positive way, And you can go so quickly and so easily down that rabbit hole. The human mind is conditioned to fear change. Change, historically, in our evolution, means danger. Change means death. There's very little that a human back in the day could rely upon. And so any sort of change typically meant a problem. And so we're hardwired to avoid change. And then you get what could be described as a seismic change like this. And if you're fragile, it all comes down. Even if you're not fragile, even if you're just simply human. I'm lucky that I spent 10 years not exactly building up an armor, but confronting a lot of my insecurities and confronting a lot of my anxieties and learning how, up to a point at least, to manage them. And of course, developing a spiritual consciousness. And so when I came to this situation, I was able to apply all of that stuff. And even with 10 years of training behind it, I faltered regularly, right? I wobbled a lot. But my great success is that I've made it through so far, and we have made it through so far together. And that may seem a little bit esoteric. That may seem a strange thing, but in fact, it's not. It's the evidence of personal growth. It's the evidence of personal development. And what could be more successful than that? Right? And so maybe you sit down to undertake this exercise right now. You look at the past year and you feel like, well, I didn't make any more money. And I didn't do this and I didn't do that. And maybe you're looking in the wrong places to identify your successes. Maybe simply surviving that year was a great success all on its own that you don't acknowledge. Even if you didn't do it with a whole lot of dignity, you did it. Maybe you worked your friggin' job that you hate, and that's a certain level of perseverance too. And that can be a success. And maybe you looked after your family, and maybe you kept a roof over your head. Or maybe you did some subtle thing, some simple thing, like give a few bucks to a homeless guy or donate to something. This comes back to this idea of alleviating suffering in the world. And you think, well, I didn't accomplish a whole lot last year. I only played 25 gigs. What kind of a full-time working musician is that? Well, it isn't one. But if we're looking at the Ram Dass scale, maybe I helped to alleviate some suffering on those nights with my bandmates, because we don't know who was in the audience. We don't know who showed up in the audience, who had met somebody on Canada Day weekend and been ghosted. We don't know whose marriage fell apart. We don't know whose mom died. We don't know whose kid was sick. We don't know who lost a job. We don't know who had a car accident the week before. We don't know. But maybe those people came to those gigs and had a good time, and maybe for a couple hours escaped the darkness in their own life, and maybe it helped lift them out of that darkness. And ditto my podcasts. I hear that once in a while. Once in a while, I'll get a message from somebody that says, hey, that last episode really resonated with me, and thank you for that. And I don't take credit for that. I'm grateful. Thank you very much for that. I appreciate the people who give me that kind of feedback. Maybe I helped. Maybe just doing this podcast that not a whole hell of a lot of people listen to alleviated suffering for one lonely person out there, or gave somebody a tool that he or she or they could use to alleviate their own suffering, or could pass on to somebody else who was suffering. Maybe I made a music recommendation that opened up somebody's new favorite artist or favorite song, and they had been really sad, but now they got this new thing that's interesting to them. Maybe I inspired much better drummers than me who are reluctant to play out, to go test the water, and maybe their life is utterly changed too, the way mine did like 15 years ago. Maybe. And so when you look at your life on the Ram Dass Index, you think I haven't been very successful, but think about it in other terms. Have you alleviated suffering in the world? Right? Going to that job of yours, which is a customer service job, and you hate those customers. You'd like to smack their heads against the window. But did you help them? Right? In whatever position you're in, did you help those customers with whatever it was they needed, and thereby alleviate in some way their suffering? Or in your company, or maybe you are in health services or social services, and you're on the front line, and you're dealing with people every day who are genuinely physically suffering, and you alleviated some of that suffering. Well, that is success, kids. That is success, and that's the greatest success. Money, whatever. I want more of it. Everybody does. Elon friggin' Musk wants more money. That's why he's running the United States government. But is that the real measure? You can't take it with you, kids. And so as I'm looking at the situation in LA, and as I'm contemplating the past year before, again, moving on into the new year, it comes back to this idea of suffering. It exists in the world. It exists in me. It exists in you. It exists in everyone. And so maybe the highest virtue really does become, how do we alleviate suffering in the world, even in some small way. $5 to a homeless guy, and they say, don't do that. They just spend it on drugs. Well, yeah, maybe some of them do, but not all of them do. And so I have a clear conscience about that sort of thing. And I think your intent matters. I think life responds to your intent. There's this idea of reciprocity. You get back what you give. And if you give out to the world empathy and sympathy and understanding, then I think good things come back to you. And you should extend those things to yourself, kids. So don't sit there and say, well, I didn't make a lot of money last year, and so it was not successful. If you alleviated suffering in the world, then you've built yourself some karma, man, and you can reasonably expect that karma to come back to you in some way. I know that's woo-woo. I know that's esoteric. I know in the face of a lot of what goes on in the world, it seems silly. But I actually think it's true, and I think if you examine your own life, you'll probably find that it's true as well. Didn't know how far I was going to get this time. Didn't know if I really had anything to say, and maybe I didn't. There are times when I have it all laid out and I have a certain amount of energy or silliness in it, but I'm not feeling energetic or all that silly right now. There's serious stuff going on. And part of alleviating suffering would be to do an entertaining and silly podcast. And right now, for me this week, that's just not what it is. I got this stuff on my mind, and I think it's important to talk about it. So I thank you listening. I thank you for listening. And I hope you're doing okay. I hope that person you met on New Year's Eve has written back to you, and love grows where your rosemary goes. And I hope all is well with you. Heavy week coming up, kids, in American politics. There are only so many things you can control, I guess. And you have to protect yourself to the extent you can from letting the darkness creep in. Look for the heroes. Look for the selfless acts. Look for the people who are working to alleviate that suffering. And perhaps we can all aspire to be that as well. I'm going to go because I'm a working man. Got stuff to do. Want to thank you listening as long as you have listened. And take care of yourselves. Reach out to people who you think might be suffering. See what opportunities exist for you to alleviate that suffering. Maybe next week I'll be a little more chipper. Hopefully, but all is well here. I hope all is well with you. And hey, kids, I'll check you later. Yeah. I didn't do a music recommendation. I haven't had a chance to listen to a lot of new music, but eventually I'll get back on that train. In the meantime, go listen to something you already love.